Today's lecture is about energy dynamics and how it relates to our ecosystem. What is ecology? Ecology is looking at what is nature. How are all of them connected? Not just the life, but the non-life. If we look at the life, if we start an individual organism, a whole bunch of them that are all the same is called a population. When you look at all the populations within an area, like say La Cañada, that includes everything from the dogs to the cats to the grass. If we look at the individual communities putting together, that makes up an ecosystem. An ecosystem, all the ecosystems of the planet make up our biosphere. Now, there are two secrets for survival in ecology. One of them is energy flow and matter cycle. Matter cycles. We have the same water we had 3.5 billion years ago, but the energy we have now has only been around for a week or two. Earth receives 1/1000th, only 1/1000th, because we're so small compared to all the output of the sun. 34% of it before it reaches is reflected. Eventually, 66% of it will be absorbed by chemicals in the land, ocean, and then reflected back up into the atmosphere. And eventually it's going to be radiated out to space. The light that comes through the atmosphere is visible, IR, and a small part of UV that's not absorbed by the ozone layer. The visible and IR and UV all warm the troposphere and the land, taking the color, absorbing it, and re-emitting it at infrared. It evaporates water, generates winds, photosynthesis, and eventually it goes back up and is absorbed by the atmosphere. About half of it is re-emitted out to space, half of it is re-emitted back down, and that's what keeps us warm. Looking at this again, this is what the greenhouse effect or global warming is all about, where the light hits, the UV is absorbed by the ozone, the visible and some of the infrared goes in, it's absorbed, and then it's re-emitted as infrared, and eventually it leaves the planet. So what is it? What is energy? How do living things get energy? How do living things use energy? And how does the energy cycle through the ecosystem? Well, we get energy ultimately from the sun. The sun goes down to plants, and plants use photosynthesis to create the chemicals, to create the chemical bonds for chemicals, for food. We use the chemical energy from food, and we break that potential energy of the food, and we then use that to create more body systems, or to move, or to other things. Now, this solar energy also does various other things. It's going to cause the biochemical cycles, everything from the carbon cycle to the phosphorus, nitrogen, water, and oxygen. Those things cycle. For example, the carbon will cycle through photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and so forth all the way down. We'll be learning about those a little bit later. Again, the sunlight comes down, it hits a producer. Some primary consumers eat the producer, then secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and eventually those things die and they're decomposed, but we'll go more into that detail. So there are all kinds of ways that we can metabolize food. One of them is by the sun. What happens there is that they are self-feeders. They're autotrophs. Troph means feeder, auto means self. They convert sunlight into organic molecules, into sunlight and inorganic molecules into food. We, on the other hand, are heterotrophs. We eat other things. Troph eating, hetero others. We obtain our food from other organisms, be it autotrophs or from other heterotrophs. Now, life and not life. we are all kinetic and connected. In other words, the biotic factors, the living components of the ecosystem, and the abiotic components are all connected. Can you see all the biotic, like the fish, the coral? The abiotic would be the water, the rocks, and stuff like that. Now, the biotic components of the ecosystem include the producers, the autotrophs. They, via photosynthesis, are the source of all food for the rest of us. Consumers are the heterotrophs. We use aerobic respiration if we use oxygen, or anaerobic respiration, giving off methane and sulfur gas, if we are anaerobic. The D&Ds, they're the matter recyclers. They're the FBI. They're the ones that take all the dead components and make it available for producers and consumers. But what is the FBI? So detritivores versus decomposers are parts of the FBI. Detritivores are those that scavenge waste or dead bodies, break them down so that those materials, that inorganic compounds, can go back down into the soil as plant nutrients. The decomposers break down things that are already dead, like leaf litter and non-living, and they, again, recycle the nutrients back into the soil so we can continue going. Again, these are known as FBI, the fungi, bacteria, and the insects. Insects are particularly more tetrativores. So we are also going to be studying not just the flow of material, but also how does energy flow through the system. Well, this is a food chain. This is basically a one-way flow of energy in a system. Notice how the arrows go from the higher energy, the sun, down towards the plant. And then from the plant to the primary consumers, from the primary consumers to the secondary consumers, and then down to either the detritivores or the decomposers. And then it goes around again. That's how the energy flows, and then it's re-emitted out to space. Sometimes, however, it can become more complicated. If we take, for example, we can look at an individual food chain. For example, if we go here, we go from the plant, we can go from the plant up to this bug, over to the bird, up to the owl, or we can go from the plant to this guy, up to the mouse, over to the mosquito, and up to this guy. That is a food chain. However, when we put it all together, it becomes what's known as a food web, where there's all the interconnected parts. Now, one of the places where this is going to fall apart is if we get rid of the secondary consumers. That's going to cause havoc on the rest of the system. Now, this is what's known as a food pyramid, or an energy pyramid. This is how energy travels for the ecosystem. It first hits the primary consumers, and it has a certain amount of energy. Say 1 million joules of sunlight hits the plants. 10,000 of that joules of that is going to be used by the primary consumers, and then when by the primary producers, and then when the primary consumers eat it, they're only going to be able to use 1,000. Why? Because the plant uses 9,000 of it to grow, to produce its flowers and stuff like that, and all the way down. And so again, it goes down 10% each level. Why? Because 90% of the energy is used by the plant animal to grow and do its things. This is what we typically think of as a pyramid, but actually if you look at it as far as the energy, it doesn't look like a pyramid at all. It goes from 1 million to 100 to 100,000 to and all the way down. So as we move up, 90% of the energy is lost when moving up not one layer. Energy is lost in the form of heat, respiration, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. The actual is somewhere between 5 and 20% of each layer is used for growing and doing things, but the average, what we typically say is the rule of thumb is 10%. The more trophic levels in the food chain, the less and less are available as we go farther up. Therefore, we do not have infinite long food chains because there would not be enough energy to make it to the end. Sometimes, however, instead of looking at the pyramid of energy, we look at the pyramid of numbers. If we look at a single oak tree, it may have thousands and thousands of leaves, but it's one tree. It may support 2,000 caterpillars, which support 90 blue tits. This is just for your information. Pyramid of biomass, however, is looking at what is the mass level, not the energy, but the mass level. And again, it's vast majority of it is lost to the environment. So what are some of the implications? Would we as humans be better if we ate higher or lower on the food chain, if we ate only producers, if we were all herbivores? Why are food chains more rarely above 4 or 5 trophic levels? Probably because it run out of energy. Why do marine food webs have greater efficiency? Why are there so few top-level consumers? Why are these species usually first to suffer if an ecosystem is disrupted? If the producers or primary consumers are disrupted, what happens to the tertiary consumers? So another thing we need to look at is primary productivity. How much energy do we get? The conversion of light into chemical energy is called gross primary productivity. That is all the light energy that goes into the plant. Plant then use that for maintenance and growth. The energy that goes on to the next layer is called the net primary productivity. So the gross primary productivity changes across the nation. If we look at it, we have different layers that are able to use different amounts of energy. For example, if we look at the southwest portion of the United States where there's lots of water, lots of humidity, they have a fairly high gross primary productivity. Whereas when we're looking at the deserts, over here, or up in the mountains, okay, there's not going to be as high of primary productivity because they're not able to use it as efficiently. So net primary productivity is a rate that photosynthesis happens minus the energy goes to cellular respiration. In other words, the gross primary is how much is produced by the plant. Net is what is lost due to respiration. In other words, for it to grow, for it to produce flowers, for it to produce fruit. So primary productivity is measured by net primary productivity is equal to gross minus respiration, where net is how much is used or is stored in new biomass by the consumers. Gross is how much is converted from solar energy to chemical energy. So let's practice. If we say that net primary productivity is equal to gross minus respiration, and if we look at this, if net primary productivity of a wetland was 8,000 calories per meter squared per year, and respiration was 12,000, what is the gross primary productivity for the year, for that ecosystem for the year? If we look at that, we can see that the original equation, we need to rearrange because we're asking for gross primary productivity. And if we look at that, when we rearrange that, that means that net primary productivity plus the respiration is equal to the gross. So when we rearrange that and plug it in, we get 8,000 plus the 12,000 is equal to 20,000 per year. Any questions on that? I hope not, because I can't answer them. We'll answer them in class. But what's interesting is there's vast differences in the productivity of different biosystems. Estuaries have huge amounts of productivity. Why? Because they are at the end of a river where there's all the nutrients coming down through the river, and they hit the estuaries where there's plenty of water, there's plenty of sunlight, there's plenty of nutrients, and therefore they have huge productivity. Whereas if we look at a desert, it has little productivity. Why? Because it has very, very little. Open ocean has very little per square meter. Why? Because there's not a lot of plants on the top of the ocean. However, if we look at the ocean as a whole, it has some of the largest amounts total of primary productivity. So some of the important facts about all this: some producers are ultimate source. Since producers are a source of all food, why don't we just harvest all the world's marshes? Why don't we clear cut the forest to grow crops for humans? They did that last year. What's going to happen to the amount of oxygen put back into the atmosphere? Why not harvest all the primary producers of the world's vast oceans? Why? Because that's where a lot of the oxygen comes from. We get rid of that, we get rid of a lot of the fish, we get rid of a lot of the oxygen. So, why do we care about biodiversity? Biodiversity gives us natural resources such as food, water, wood, energy, medicines, and natural services like air and water purification so we don't get too much CO2, so that we have drinkable water, soil fertility, waste disposal, pest control, and we'll come back to natural services again. If we look at these, there are all kinds of biodiversity. There's functional, ecological, species diversity, and genetic, and again, we'll be hitting these again. Any questions? That's the end for today. Thank you very much.